Hello, I'm Barry Osborne, and you're looking at a presentation that was used for the Ayr Presbytery of the Church of Scotland in May 2019. This slide presentation is put together as a summary of what we talked about that day. So it's an aid memoir for those that were in attendance, and also something that can be used by those who were not able to attend. It's available for anybody who would find it helpful. If you want more particular information, or you'd like to know how to adapt this in some way personally for a particular church or a small group of churches, please contact me. All the contact information will come up at the end of this presentation. Thank you. The presentation fell into two parts. The first part was called Dare to Dream, and I've been encouraging small and rural churches to dream. We don't have to have things the way they are. It may be we feel inadequate, it may be that we've been in decline, but things don't need to remain the same. Things can change. So we want to change the narrative. This, oh, we can't do it. We don't have the resources. We don't have the money. We don't have the talents. Don't have the people, whatever it might be. Things do not have to be impossible. So that's what we'll be working on. Now, in connection with this, the first part of the presentation use this mission development cycle. It's actually an organizational development cycle, and I picked up on this when I did my management studies with university. So it was intended to adapt that for rural churches. Basically, it's a simple cycle that starts at 12 o'clock saying what's the current problem, what are the issues for us at this time, and then it moves around in a clockwise direction. What are the implications? What do we learn? How can we learn more about the situation? How might we then develop strategies and formulate those? How would we then determine which are the appropriate strategies to use? How do we go about implementing it? And then having implemented it, we evaluate it, see where we've got to, and then start the cycle again. So I've used this in a pastoral context, I've used it in a mission context, and I'm drawing on it for this particular presentation because I know that it can be helpful. But I don't want us to think that it all depends on human effort. Get the organization right, it'll all be okay. We cannot see the situation change unless God is in it. So that's something we'll look at a bit more in part two. So let's start with confronting what the situation is for the Church of Scotland at this time. And the answer is, well, the Church of Scotland has been significantly in decline. In 1984, 16.9%, almost 17% of the population of Scotland attended a Church of Scotland. I think actually correct that. I think this is actually the overall church attendance figures. And in 2002, it had gone down to 11%, and then 2016, 7%. So the number of people going to church in Scotland is going down. Now, this is interesting as I'm English, and I've been dealing with a context in which churches have been in decline much more in England and Wales than they are in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But Scotland and Northern Ireland, sad to say, are catching up with the decline that has been experienced in other parts of the United Kingdom. Now, at the same time as church attendances have gone down, the population in Scotland has actually been steadily going up. So that makes the situation even worse. And on the census day, church attendance in Scotland was actually down by almost 32%. That's very nearly a third of the congregations had disappeared over a period of time, relatively short of time. So let's just look at that in this diagram, which shows the change in Scottish church attendance between 2002 and 2016. That's where the decline went from 11.2% down to 7.2%. And we were looking at Ayr, and Ayr falls in the area, if I've got my geography right, possibly around 30 to 40%, something like that, church decline. So quite serious. The only area that has seen a significant less is right up in the northeast. So Here's another diagram which is helpful. A change in Scottish church attendances, and if you look at that, that again gives you the clear picture. The diagrams, incidentally, come from Hope for the Rural Church, produced by Acts in Scotland, Action of Churches Together in Scotland, and copies of the report are available from them. We had them available on the day, and all copies went. So, decline in congregations, again, you can see a significant 11% decline in the total number of congregations between 2002 2016, and at the same time we're aging. So decline rate 11%, as I've already mentioned, but the aging percentage has shifted enormously. 2002, 28% of the churches congregations were over 65. By 2020, it's expected to be 44%. We're moving towards half of our congregation being over 65. I can tell you, I think the situation is far worse in England and Wales, but we ought to be alarmed about the situation in Scotland. Now, this then is the overall position. I've talked about attendances declining and average age increasing. At the same time, clergy numbers tend to be declining. That means often that the clergy burden is increasing. There's much more for a person to do. That leads to frustration, and people find their time is being taken up doing things they do not feel God called them to. So instead of doing their pastoral and teaching ministry, they find themselves doing management and administration and so on. So huge amount of growing frustration and discouragement as a result of that. In England, it's Wales, quite significant. But how about this? Your influence in Scottish society is declining. There was a time when the Church of Scotland was listened to in Scotland. That is tending to weaken. Your influence in society is diminishing. So let's move on to the next stage in the cycle, the implication and the education aspects. And one of the things that was stressed when I was trained to use this model was the importance of engaging the whole of the church, the whole of your congregation in this process. To sit down, okay, what is the implication if things don't change? Well, the writing's on the wall. If things don't change, they'll be exactly the same as happened in other parts of the United Kingdom. Churches will fall into disuse, and the whole thing will snowball. It'll gradually get worse and worse and worse. In England, we have one denomination that in a 10-year period closed over 3,000 church buildings. Another denomination actually, in almost as soon as it was formed in 1972, it actually declined so fast they'd lost about a third of their church members and their churches. So serious situation. Can't allow things to remain as they are. But what can we learn? Well, here we are. Scotland could perhaps learn from what's been done in England and Wales to reverse situations. Can it be done? How can it be done? But if you actually engage the whole church in the discussion and encourage things, perhaps using things like getting everybody to put in their ideas, and catching them on flip charts and so on, then it might be worthwhile. But there's also publications, and we in Rural Mission Solutions are happy to give help and support. So the implication: further decline, increased stress on the system, closed churches, fewer services. We now have churches in England that have one service a month, and being seen as increasingly seen as irrelevant. What's actually causing this? Well, obviously that's important. If we go through the education aspect, we need to say, okay, what is or what might be the cause? So here are my suggestions. I think one of the issues is there's a widening culture gap. I worked with some churches and asked them to write down all the things that have changed in their homes over a 50-year period. Now, that was interesting. They went from linoleum to carpet. They went from radio to colour TVs. to using the internet. All sorts of things changed. Automatic washing machines, computerized heating systems, all sorts of things. And then I asked them to write down all the things that changed in the church during that same period, and they had very few things to put down. So not much has changed in the church context, but a great deal has changed in the world around. So that's quite a significant issue for us to bear in mind, a widening culture gap. Incidentally, on that culture gap, the situation is such that if I was to ask most churches, people in most churches, to indicate if they go into betting shops, it's probable that very few do. And very few would not know what to do if they did go into a betting shop. They wouldn't know the language, the jargon that's used, what does it mean each way or on the nose or whatever. You can see I don't use a betting shop, so I don't know these terms, but I hear about them. I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know how to operate, what to say to anybody that's there. And that's how people feel about coming into church. If they're not part of the church culture already, it's alien. We need to know that. And often our premises are very unattractive. Now, we might not like to realize that. We might not need to say that. No, we've got lovely buildings, but often they're actually quite unattractive. We have a presentation on these things in Rural Mission Solutions. It's accessible on YouTube, about does your image hinder your mission? And indeed it does. And often the church has poor image. And again, we might not want to think that. I spoke to somebody in the Church of England, one of the leaders recently, who was very offended when I said that most people in our villages have a poor image of what church is about. But the reality is they see it as being there for their main events, for births and christenings or baptisms, for marriages and for funerals, but they're not supporting at other times. And often it's because church has a poor image. Sometimes that's deserved, and sometimes it's just what's being projected through the media. Another aspect is that we often operate in the wrong market. Now, back in the 1980s, I was then undergoing university management studies, and in one of the situations we were looking at, we were told a situation about Parker pens. Parker pens that were actually facing a crisis. They were about to go out of business, and they needed to know why. And we were asked, who did we think were the main competitors in their marketplace? So if a Parker pens, nice quality pen, was declining in sales, where are people going? And usually, you can try running this if you pause the video and just try and work it out yourself. People will come up with two possible solutions. One is they talk about Schaefer and high quality pens, and the other is they talk about Bic and cheap pens. Well, neither of those is the main competitor for Parker pens during the 1980s. And their main competitor was, in actual fact, Ronson lighters. So why? Why were they losing business to Ronson lighters? And the answer is that they were in the gift business, not the writing implement business. So they were in the gift market, and people wanting to give a nice thank you gift to somebody would give a Ronson lighter rather than a Parker pen. So knowing which market you're in is important. And if we are Sunday orientated in our church life, we are in the leisure market. That's who our competitors are. And we need to understand that nature of that market, and we need to adapt what we do, not necessarily who we are, certainly not what we believe, but how we do things need to change. Children these days and people who are students all are used to smart boards and computer generated images and things like that. And if we're still using paper and we haven't even moved to digital projection, we're a long way behind. So understanding the nature of the market and how we can relate to it's really important. And once a week church, well, that's a sad thing. You know, that's what a lot of Christians, a lot of people who come to church don't expect anything more. Church is what we do on a Sunday morning. That's it. And so, it's not very exciting, not very significant. Isn't it more important than that? Well, that, as the world looks on, no, because that's all they see of us. They don't see anything more than that. And then we're very building orientated. Everything tends to have to happen inside sacred walls. Now, I don't know why that is, because Jesus hardly operated in sacred walls and largely operated in the open air. Of course, the climate was better where he was, but maybe we need to think about where we actually do things. And I'm quite keen on encouraging things to be done in public places. One village church in which I was significantly involved had a harvest Thanksgiving at the local pub because they were putting on a special event with a hog roast. So they adapted their hog roast, merged with the church, had a wonderful time on the Saturday. On Sunday morning, the marquee at the pub was used for the church meetings, and that was a great success as well. Staying with the courses, there are a few more for us to consider. We have very much a one-person, one-way ministry inside a culture, the wider culture, which is much more interactive, much more about engaging and discussing issues, not sitting listening to sermons. And often our membership is not empowered, so all they are is passive participants. Are they actually even participate? Well, they might sing the hymns and maybe occasionally pray. But in the main, they are not empowered. And yet the first church was clearly much more about all the people being part of the church and being part of the mission and the outreach and the ministry. And I'm glad that churches are coming back to the concept of all-member ministry. But we're wasting human resources if we are not empowering members in our church, and we're relying too much on professional ministry. And often the preaching style is inappropriate. Again, it's not discussional, it doesn't engage, and people have a tendency not to listen and sometimes fall asleep. And so we need to be trying to avoid sermonizing. Now, you can give a beneficial Bible talk or a social issue without actually having to follow an homiletical style that was developed in the 1900s, 1930s at the latest. And then what about the worship style? Is that appropriate? Now, often we're still using forms of worship in a rural church that would be exactly the same as what's going on in a town church. Certainly, if we're following liturgical patterns, that's quite probable that that will be happening. But is that really appropriate for a smaller group? And I often encourage people who are taking ministry in small congregations to think, how would you do this in a home group rather than a cathedral? Many years ago, a colleague coined the phrase, tangerines are not small oranges. There's something that's different. They're easier to get into, they're tasty. There are lots of good things about tangerines. So bearing in mind that there is something distinct between a village church and a town church is really important. If you're working with people who know one another well and have got a relationship outside the church, then that needs to be experienced, enriched inside the church. I'm very concerned about how we train clergy. I think this is a major cause of decline. We train them without teaching them how to pastor and relate to and minister in a small congregation. We need to change that if we want to provide appropriate leadership. Another area I'm concerned about is the lack of hospitality. Now, I kind of guess I don't know who's watching this, but if I was to say to you, how would you describe your church? It's quite probable you'd say we're friendly. You might say we're welcoming. I want to ask, are you hospitable? Think about what's the experience when someone comes to your church for the first time. They may get a handshake, maybe a warm handshake at the door. They may be given some books. It's unlikely they'll be told where the toilet is if there is a toilet. It's unlikely anybody will offer to take their coat from them. It's unlikely that they won't be offered a drink. Well, maybe after the service, but will somebody actually offer to get it for them? I don't know that they will. And will anybody help them to know when to stand, when to sit, when to kneel, all of those things, you know? Will anybody be introduced to them by name? Now, think about what would happen if I was an old friend of yours and I happened to be driving past your area and I had a few minutes to spare. It's winter time, so I've driven to your house without warning you, and I've turned up on your doorstep, cold and wrapped up. What kind of welcome do I get? I kind of guess you'll be pleased to see me, and you'd know my name. Maybe you don't take much time to get to know the names if people come to your church for the first time, but you'd know my name if I called at your house. You'd invite me in, especially if it's cold outside. You'd offer to take my coat. You'd ask me if I needed the toilet. If the coffee's on the go, you'd invite me to have some coffee, or else you'll offer to put the pot on and make some coffee. And if you've got another visitor, you'd introduce me to that person. You'd sit me somewhere comfortable and warm. You'd make me the focus of your interest and attention for a while. All of those things. And that's hospitality. And when it's time to go, again, I'd be thanked for coming. I'd be encouraged to come again if ever I'm passing. I'd be asked, did I want the toilet? I would be given my coat, and I'd be encouragingly sent off with lots of love and waves. Do you see the difference between being what some people call welcoming in church and what is hospitable? And if you're going to be more hospitable, who are the people who've got the hospitality gift? Use those. Please do not put an elderly, grumpy person on the door who's got an awful handshake and doesn't smile. Oh dear, that's terrible. But that's what exists in so many of our churches. No wonder we're declining. Well, we've a few more causes. I think often there's a lack of joy in church. I'm always a bit have mixed feelings when people say to me after I've perhaps taken a service in a church from, they say, I really enjoyed church today. Well, that's nice and encouraging. I am pleased that they enjoyed it. But I'm sorry that they don't apparently enjoy church every Sunday. Why aren't they enjoying church? Where is this idea that we've got to be miserable in church? Now, at the risk of offending my friends in Scotland, I'm going to tell you a story of an event that took place. I used to be the president of my denomination, which isn't Church of Scotland, and on one occasion I visited a church in Scotland in the middle of winter. It was very cold. I was shown into the minister's vestry, which was not only cold but damp. It was heated by a single bar fire that wasn't doing much in the way of putting out heat, and left there for 10 or 15 minutes. Then I was collected by somebody and taken to the choir vestry. On the way, we passed an open door that showed the way into the main area of the church, the sanctuary. There was a small congregation sitting, huddled in their coats, shivering, obviously very cold. I entered the choir vestry. It was lovely. It was quite cozy and warm, very nice. So I jokingly said, oh, this is splendid. Perhaps we ought to go and get the congregation members and ask them to join us in this room. And everybody laughed, except somebody didn't laugh. And all I heard was, can we remember where we are? I don't know that God minds jokes. I certainly think Jesus probably laughed quite a lot. I kind of think some of his parables were told with a twinkle in the eye. Why do we have to be miserable in church? No wonder we're declining. And then there's this resistance to change. You know, nothing must change. You know the story of the Church of England vicar who wanted to move a piano from one side of the church to the other, but it was incredibly resisted, so he moved it a few inches each week. Well, of course, that's silly. But change is often resisted in a church context, somehow because the way we've inherited it is precious to us, and we don't want to lose what is already precious. But we're losing congregations because we are resisting change. Now, change management is a big issue. It was a major part of my university studies. So I lecture and teach on how to manage change in a church context. And I haven't time to do that here. But it needs to be managed. If you're going to have change, make sure it's managed. And if you're introducing it at a church meeting, a meeting of your elders or something like that, and if it's controversial, there are ways of having these meetings without upsets and tears. And again, I can provide advice, and I think you might find that we have a video about that on YouTube as well. Now, a major issue is churches without a clear mission statement, no definition of purpose. Why are they here? We're here to worship God. Can you clarify that a bit more? Well, often they can't. So there's a sense of being part of something that isn't actually going anywhere because it doesn't know why it's there. That leads to a lack of vision, and with it a lack of expectation. So week after week, month after month, year after year, nothing is changing. It's not going anywhere. Nobody seems to think there is somewhere to go even. So we don't expect things to be different. And another factor is that our churches are sometimes not evangelistically driven. Now, I didn't say evangelically. I'm talking about the sharing of the gospel story. And if we are not evangelistically driven, if we don't have that sense of purpose, then no wonder we're going to fail. If I was running a secular business and I had a wonderful product and all of that was fine, but I didn't invest in sales, well, that would be stupid. No wonder I'd go out of business. And in the church context, God has given us evangelists, and we need to understand how to use that evangelistic gift. I'm going to explain more about that in a few moments. But our churches all ought to be evangelistically driven. The gospel we have is not our own, it's His, and He wants us to share it with others. Must remember that. Another factor causing the decline is either that we don't have publicity or it's poor. And church magazines are often the worst. Church notice sheets and church magazines do more to keep people away from church than almost anything other than the people that come already. So there's a big issue there about publicity. Let's move on. As the circle moves on, we come to formulation and determination. So we've understood what are the causes, and you might well have come up with a number of different ones. May have disagreed with all of mine. That's fine. I don't mind. But you hopefully have noted down the ones you think might be right, and then you can start to tackle them. So we come then to formulation. How can we develop appropriate strategies? Now, again, if you're using all the brain power of your congregation, you can generate ideas. We used to talk about brainstorming, but sometimes that's not a popular term and sometimes causes offense. But the idea is that you pool ideas. So arrange for there to be a lively, energetic occasion, and please start with some social activity, even if it's drinking tea and coffee and having a little natter for a few minutes before you do it. But then you're going to work on the idea of, okay, you've identified something about what's wrong, what the consequences of are going to be if nothing's done, and what might be causing it. Okay, so you've done all of that. So now, what are the strategies? Now, encourage people to come up with as many ideas as possible. Do not evaluate them, do not comment on them, and welcome them all. And sometimes what may seem a silly suggestion may turn out to be something positive, such as the one I heard about a shop that's in a little row of shops in a town, and business was declining in a hardware shop, and they didn't know what they might do, and so called a staff meeting, and we're sharing ideas in much the same way as I've encouraged you to. And one of the employees said, look, a lot of cars and buses go past these row of shops. We sell nails. Why don't we scatter nails outside, and then it'll bring all the transport to a stop and bring people into the shop? Well, it was really half a joke, wasn't it? Perhaps not a very good one, but the owner of the business liked the idea and thought, hey, there's something here. So he approached the local authority and he said, buses pass this row of shops and none of them stop here. could we please have a bus stop just outside these shops? And they put one right outside his shop, and his business increased enormously. You see, so sometimes accepting silly ideas and then turning them over in your mind can lead to something better. But of course, once you've got a whole load of possible ideas, you've then got to narrow it down to one particular strategy, or maybe a couple of strategies. So how do you do that? Well, one way in which you can do it is that you use a matrix to evaluate the ideas and focus on what is most likely to succeed. So let me illustrate that for you. Here's the matrix, excuse me. So along the top there are strategies. Now this is actually based on a mission I did for an Anglican parish church in Norfolk. They wanted to reach men, they wanted to link with young families, they wanted to demonstrate themselves as a caring church in the community, they wanted to put down pathways for people who might like to explore the faith, and they also wanted to address the issue of serious doubters, people who were perhaps atheistic, closed their minds to church life. So we came up with a number of ideas, and this was some of the ideas, not all of them. Running an alpha course, grilling the minister, that's the minister goes to the pub and lets people ask him questions about his personal faith and life. And then maybe putting on monthly barbecues was another suggestion. Some people thought maybe a house survey would be useful to do. So these were ideas. So what we then did, we evaluated them, said, okay, alpha course, how effective that will be in reaching men. Well, it might do, but not exclusively men. There'll be women reached as well, so we score it 5 out of 10. How effective would it be linking with young families? We thought very unlikely. They're far too busy and can't quite see that working. That might not work. What about showing we care? Well, you can't see that it scores much on that. What about laying down a pathway for seekers? Brilliant. An alpha course is ideal for that. That really would work well. And what about addressing serious doubters? Well, it ought to do that as well. So they were scored higher. So we did that along each of these lines. I'm not going to take time to explain it. You can look at the diagram, you can work it out yourself, and you can develop your own one. And what we then did, we highlighted the ones that scored highest. So we could see that grilling the minister actually had 3 high points. So that was clearly a good strategy to try. And then running the alpha course, well, that was going to be effective in some of our targets, and monthly barbecues were going to be effective in another aspect. So all of those 3 strategies were worth pursuing. Well, I can tell you, whatever was done in this particular church where we piloted this particular process, it certainly turned the church around. So we've moved on from determining what we're going to do, and we come to implementing it. Now, this needs to be done very carefully. And on the screen, you see the words, use Kipling's 6 honest serving men. Now, see if I can remember this quote correctly. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I need to do. Their names were what and where and when and how and why and who. Now, I might not have quoted that right, but those 6 questions, what, where, when, how, why, who, need to be applied to all that you do. Who are the best people to do X or Y? Okay. How might we go about doing X and Y and advertising it? When would be the best time to hold X and Y? So you're just doing all that. 6 honest serving men. What, where, when, how, why, who. You apply those questions to any of your strategies as you enter into the implementation. And the other thing you need to do is you need to break down what you're doing to simple tasks, not just the broad brush approach, but think of it in simple tasks. And we use the expression SMART tasks. SMART stands for simple, measurable, attractive, realistic or realizable, and timed. So you're not vaguely traveling, you're putting down specific markers. You're doing something for a particular reason, to achieve a particular outcome, and you're going to evaluate whether or not you've succeeded. So that's why you do that. So once you're implementing, you're moving to evaluating. You might say, okay, we're going to implement these ideas and we'll look at it 6 months from now or 1 year from now and see if we have achieved. But what we're going to do is not just say, yes, we have achieved it, or no, we haven't. We're going to ask those questions. And we're going to say, why have we achieved, or why have we not achieved? Was it the wrong time? Did we get the when bit wrong? Did we use the wrong people? Was it the who aspect that was wrong? So you can do that. Look and see what's working and ask why, and then start the whole process over again. So changing the narrative. Things can change. They don't have to remain the same. Problems can become opportunities. There is nothing that is too hard for the Lord. And even though we may be small, that does not mean it's impossible. Just think about the people God used. Gideon, Moses, a young lad with a few loaves and fishes, a young man with a sling and a stone. You know, things can change. God uses what is small. That's what he likes to do, so that other people don't get the honor. We don't think we can manage on our own without him. So being small is an opportunity. Maybe it only takes one person to change the narrative. And let's remember that prayer changes things and prayer changes people. I can tell you this, the most of the exciting activities, areas of mission in which I've been involved, where we've seen the most fruitfulness, we've planted churches and seen churches grow, is always where there's been prayer. So that's the start to dream. Okay. What might your church look like in 6 months' time? Now, as we move to the part 2, which is making dreams come true, I'm going to use the story of Nehemiah from Scripture in order to illustrate some of these things. So I'm sure the story is familiar, but if not, read together Nehemiah chapter 1. Now, the first thing is that nothing happens if we are comfortable. Okay, we need to be made uncomfortable. We need some discomfort to move us from where we are to where we ought to be. And the situation for Nehemiah was that some brothers had come and he'd asked them, what's it like back in Jerusalem? And they said, oh, it's really bad. The people are in a discouraged way, and the walls are broken down, the gates are burned with fire, and we're a disgrace. So that's the situation he saw. Okay, that was what made him uncomfortable. And he was very uncomfortable. He sat down and he wept. And I want to suggest that if we're not there, if we don't feel that disturbed about the way things are, then I doubt things are going to get much better. Another thing we learn from chapter 1 is he prioritized prayer. For some days, Nehemiah says, I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So we've got that. But again, that praying comes up again in chapter 2. And then in chapter 4, we have prayer again. And in chapter 6, we have prayer again. All the way through the issue of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, we have prayer. Prayer is a priority if things are to be done. I've already said that I have experienced some amazing things happen in mission work in rural areas, but the most amazing things have always happened where there has been much prayer going on for some time. You do not have because you do not ask, says James in the scriptures. If you want things to change, we need to be praying about it. When I was a young Christian, a teenager, with a group of other teenagers, and we'd come to the Lord and we were on fire for the things of God, we were unhappy about the life of the church. It was very much a social church, and it wasn't particularly well attended, although attendances back in those days were much higher, but it didn't even feel as if God came to our church. It was a bit dead, really. So as teenagers, we gave ourselves to prayer every Tuesday night from 7 o'clock to midnight. sometimes even after. And over the next couple of months, that church changed radically. I could tell you lots of stories. Of course, Scotland, the Great Hebridean Revival, well, that came about because two ladies have been spending their time, they're housebound, and they've been spending their time in prayer and had learned how to sense what God is saying to them. So in his prayer, we notice that Nehemiah acknowledges the cause of the problem. They had drifted away from a good relationship with God. But we also see that Nehemiah knows the promises of God and claims them in prayer. He knows the promises and claims them. God promised restoration, and so Nehemiah claims that in his prayer. And he's willing to offer himself as the answer to his prayer. Look at right at the end of chapter 1 that he prays that God will give him favor with the king. He's offering himself as an answer to his own prayer. And when we're praying for things to be different in our churches, are we prepared to offer ourselves? Find out what the cost is. Are we willing to offer ourselves? And then we also see that Nehemiah puts his trust in God, that things are going to change. It's going to happen because he's trusting and depending on God. And then out he goes. And the next thing he does is he undertakes an appraisal. He goes out by night, doesn't want anybody to see this, goes out quietly and silently to find out exactly what the situation is, goes out of the valley gate, and he goes all the way around the walls of Jerusalem, examining their state. Some of it so bad he can't even get past. But he goes all the way around eventually and comes back in at the valley gate. So he's done an appraisal. This is the situation. The third thing he does is, before I come to that, come back on appraisals. You may have heard of SWOT analysis. There are lots of ways in which we can do appraisals. So here's just a few comments about doing appraisals. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's used in business organizations and secular societies to turn things around. So it's looking inwardly at ourselves. What are our strengths and our weaknesses? And then we look at the context in which we are operating, what opportunities does that give, and what threats. Now, I don't think that in the main, here in the UK, our churches have threats, but we do have constraints. So if I put a C instead of a T and swap it around, I get cows analysis, which is lovely for rural. Constraints, opportunities, weaknesses, or strength. And you can do this anyway. You can just make 4 sheets of paper and write them on. What I like to do is get one large sheet of paper, perhaps from a flip chart, and divide it into quarters. So big cross in the middle. And then write on the left-hand side, strengths at the top and weaknesses at the bottom. Now, a strength might be, you may have musical talent. You may have good preachers. It could be things like that. It may be you have comfortable, warm premises. So just things that ask good things about you. And your weaknesses might be things like your average age is very high. Not many people in the congregation actually live in the local community. Any of those things, quite a number of things. Now down the right-hand side, you write your opportunities and your constraints in those two portions on the right hand side. So opportunities might be a new housing development that has taken place, or an opportunity to go into a school, a new serious Christian head teacher that welcomes input from the church. So it could be opportunities like that. And your constraints might be, for instance, that there's a thriving, raving church doing marvelous well and is packed out to the girls just a little way away. So that would be a constraint. Another constraint might be that there's a huge competition from secular activities that competing with your Sunday activities. So those are the things. So on the left hand side it's all about you, on the right hand side it's all about the context. You could do a map of your community, do a physical map, geographical map, laying out the physical aspects of the church, showing where there's housing and so on, and then put on the map, where do you have a presence? Do you have members from your church anywhere? So see where you are, that will tie in with your opportunities, and see where you're not, which links with your constraints. Okay? And then also think about what and where are the key social activities. So mark those on the map as well. So if there's a massive, great organization, I don't know, 80% of the population play golf and you've got a golf course. So map it, put it on the map. Maybe the pub is very active. Put it on the map. Where, what goes on and where do they go on? The key social activities in your community. So do a little bit of appraisal, just as Nehemiah did, looking around to see what there was. I was working down in Devon when this was said to me. I wouldn't go from here. I'd asked to go to a particular village and I'd stopped, I think I asked a farmer, and he says, oh, you wouldn't go from here if I were you. You go down the road about 2 miles, you'll come to a 4-way crossroads, you go from there, it's a lot easier. Well, we have to go from where we are. Maybe the route wants to take us to somewhere where it's going to be easier, but we start from where we are. Now, many years ago, I was part of a team doing a big presentation in Lincolnshire, and at the end we had a brains trust with a number of specialists in rural ministry making up a panel. And one man stood up to ask a question. He says, I'm a vicar from a little village church and I've had a wonderful day today. But the reality is we do not have the resources to do what we would like to do for God. Let me repeat that. I'm from a little village church, he said, and I've enjoyed today. But the reality is we do not have the resources to do what we'd like to do for God. Well, I couldn't think what to say to him, but next to me there was a new person who'd come to the area, same denomination as the man who'd asked the question, and he rose to his feet and he said, brother, don't you realize God has already given you everything you need to do what he is asking you to do right now? Say it again. God has already given you everything you need to do that he is asking you to do, right now. We go from where we are. Now, the next thing that Nehemiah does is shares the vision. So he calls all the people, as many as possible. You know, not just the leaders. Let's get everybody together. So that's why I'm saying to you, don't just get the elders, get the congregation together. You've got skills, gifts, brain power, all sorts of talents there. Call them all together. Nehemiah tells them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come on, let's rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. We will no longer be in disgrace. And I also told them about the gracious hand of my God and what the king had said to me. So he motivates them. He inspires and encourages them. Tells them the situation as it is. Tells them what will happen if nothing's done. Then says something's got to be done. But look, we've got a God who can help us. This is how I've already been experiencing God. And I'm sure, well, they were inspired and their immediate response was, let's start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Now, it was a stone at a time or a bit of timber at a time. But it started. So getting it started is important. Okay? Share the vision, share the passion. Now, mission should define and motivate your church. I love it when I come to a church and I find they've got a mission statement and they've put it up as a poster or an embroidery on the wall in their church. So your church came into being through the actions of people who had vision and mission, and their costly commitment made that vision become a reality. So we need to know we are mission people. That's where we've come from, as well as it's what God calls us to share in. So why not write a mission statement if you haven't got one already? Now, what's a mission statement? Let's think of a church. It might be called St. Jude's. So St. Jude's Church exists to, or maybe exists for. So it might be exists to proclaim God's loving message and show that love to the people in the area of wherever you are. Just something simple. A single statement single sentence statement, not a long one. You can then break it down from your overall mission statement into specific objectives, and then you can break that down to specific tasks. Okay, so your purpose, your objectives, and your tasks. You could call that potty training. And then publicize, promote, and evaluate your mission activities. When you have church meetings, so you have a session, a church Kirk session, your first item of business after prayer and after dealing with minutes of matters arising, or possibly even before the minutes of matters arising, is let's do an appraisal of the mission activities we determined last time. Let's see where it is, so that you are got mission right at the top of the agenda. Really important. Now, having a common vision is important. You're not going to go anywhere in your church if you've got people with all sorts of ideas. That's why the kind of program that I showed in the organizational development is really important, to get a commonly owned vision for mission. You might find this is available on our website to be downloaded, and you might like to give it to people and say, if this is a picture of our church, color yourself in, or identify what you think might be problems. So you need to be a bit careful. You could have a bit of an argument and a split if you're not careful. But you can see what the problem is. They're tied behind. They can't go anywhere. They're tied behind. And so often the churches can't move on because they're tied to the past. And there are people who've got different ideas. There are people who are rowing in two different directions. There are people who are fighting over the rudder. One of them, I think, is trying to dismantle the rudder because he can't take control. And there's certainly somebody trying to drill a hole in the bottom and sink the whole lot. But look, there are good things. They've got a lovely choir. Oh, that's great. And there's somebody looking after the fabric. That's so important. But nobody's paying attention to the man at the top of the mast who's pointing the direction that they're supposed to be going in. And someone's got so fed up, he has jumped overboard. I have to say, I know a few churches rather like that. Back to the can-do mentality, which is so important, part of the change of the narrative. What is the can-do mentality? Well, Jeremiah sums it up. I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? So two pictures from the Bible. The one on the right, I expect you can recognize. Okay. There was a young man who was concerned about the image of God's name. He was concerned about the reputation. The Philistines were rubbishing God by what they were taunting. Nobody was willing to go, but David was willing to go, and he went as he was. Didn't take armor. He went using what he'd got. He succeeded with what he was used to. Stones, not necessarily a small stone instead. They're usually about the size of a tennis ball or a cricket ball, and a good slingshot. The stone would leave the sling at about 100 miles an hour. So you imagine that entering poor old Goliath's head. Nothing had entered his head like that before. And so David had other things that were good. If he was to do his strengths and his weaknesses, he might say his weaknesses is, well, I'm not very good at fighting with swords, and I'm only a young chap. I've got limited experience. But what were his strengths? Well, he was fit, he was agile, and he was deadly with the sling. And when you compare that to the strengths and weaknesses of Goliath, his strengths, I'm big and I'm strong, I'm experienced. But his weaknesses, I'm slow. And the only way I can beat anybody is if I can get them to come close to me. Well, David wasn't going to come close. He got a good shot in from the distance. And then look across to the other picture, the feeding of the 5,000. I love John's version of that. Is it chapter 6, I think? John chapter 6 tells the story. And the disciples are asked what they're going to do. And one of them starts off by saying, well, if we had 8 months' wages, it wouldn't give everybody a single bite. And then Andrew finds a young lad, good old Andrew, he's great at finding people. Andrew finds a young lad who's got 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. But he says, what's the good of these among so many people? So they are overwhelmed by the greatness of the need and the smallness of the resources. But there's a little phrase in John's version that says, Jesus only asked them what they were going to do because he already knew what he was going to do. Isn't that exciting? You're thinking about growing your church and you look around and think, oh, the task's too much. We don't have the resources to do it. Don't you think Jesus already knows what he's going to do? And if we put it into his hands, we put into his hands what we have, who knows what might be done. 12 baskets left over after they'd all been fed. That's what God can do. Now, God invites us all to share in the mission. I keep coming back to this point. Get everybody involved, just as Jeremiah did. Get everybody involved, because God wants us all to share. He wants us to use our different gifts. We've all got different gifts. We've got different life experiences. We have different personalities, extroverts and introverts and so on. And he uses all our differences, and he uses them in different ways. And not all are evangelists. It's only one of the gifts God gives to his body. But all are expected to be witnesses, and we cannot witness without sharing the good news of Jesus, which is evangelism. And the great thing is, try to avoid pushing square pegs into round holes. So often when we're talking about lay ministry, lay involvement, it's really making sort of mini vicars, mini rectors, mini ministers, just sharing who we are and what we do, rather than releasing what the gifting is and the personalities are of other people. Now, the subject of evangelism puts people's backs up, and I have to deal with this a great deal. So what I like to do is start off by encouraging people to think a little bit negatively. Here's a cartoon a colleague of mine produced many years ago. I wanted him to produce a cartoon to illustrate evangelism as many people understand it. And I will come to a church, if I'm working with a church, perhaps taking them away on an away day, and I'll put this up and I'll say, how many of you, when you think evangelism, this is the kind of image in your mind? And normally the majority will put their hand up and say that's what they think evangelism is about. But evangelism means sharing good news. That's the literal meaning of the word evangelism. And if it's not good news, then it's not the good news. And I ask people to say, what's wrong? What's wrong with what this man is doing? Well, he's preaching out of his own temper and passion and anger, and I can imagine him condemning sinners, and he's really having a tirade there. And he's not really engaging. He's not come alongside. He's not empathizing in any way with the dear lady and her child. And she looks pretty scared because of his ranting. The child is even more scared, hiding behind her. So that would be a dreadful image. If it's not good news, it's not the good news. I sometimes ask people what else they see, and they say the lady's holding tightly to her purse. I think that was an accident. I don't think he deliberately put that in. But another comment I sometimes hear is, he's a long way from the church. Evangelism shouldn't be done a long way from the people of God. It's done by the people of God, for the people of God. So that's really important. So maybe start off with what's wrong. What do we not want to look like? What is it we don't want to do? Now, of course, one great evangelist was Billy Graham, and I personally have huge respect for the late Billy Graham. I think he was an amazing gift from God to the 20th century. Wonderful, wonderful, amazing man. But there's more than one way to be an evangelist. And frankly, just gossiping is an excellent way of evangelizing. And for that reason, excuse me being sexist a minute, women are marvelous evangelists because they are far better at social interaction than men. And they'll just chat happily about things, and they'll empathize with one another, and they can do amazing things. Great opportunity for friendship evangelism. I think it is the most effective form of evangelism. So evangelizing in a friendly way our friends and our family is possible, is probably the best way, and it is not actually painful. So we're going to explore that a little bit more. How might we do that? Well, of course, little ways you could do it. If somebody has a problem, you meet somebody and ask them how they are, and then if they do tell you how they are and they're not very well, opportunity to say, maybe put you on our prayer list at our church, we'd like to pray for you. Or you might be bold enough to say, can I say a prayer with you now? Or if somebody says, oh, I wish I had faith like you, are you able to say, really? Can I give you a little leaflet that'll tell you how to get it? You know, there's lots of low-key, easy, friendly opportunities to do evangelism. Right, here are 5 definitions of evangelism. And what I'd like you to do is think about each one as they come up and score it out of 5. Now, if you think it's a poor definition of evangelism from your perspective, score it 0. If you think it's good, score it 5. Now, this is an exercise, one of 3 exercises I run. I'm just going to show them to you very quickly when I take churches away and we're exploring evangelism and mission. So, introducing people to Jesus, does that sound like a good definition? Well, let's have a look at the others. But I'm not asking you to actually put them down in order that they come. It's not the ordering them 1 to 5. It's scoring each statement. So you might think introducing people to Jesus is 4 or 5. And so you put that down. But you come to one beggar telling another beggar where he can find bread, and you may not understand that. So you might want to score that 0. Or you might want to score it 3. But think these things through. There are subtle nuances that need to be understood. And what I encourage people to do is do this as individuals. So we have got some sheets which we can provide with these various activities listed on them, and you can use those very happily. Just contact me, details at the end of the presentation, and you can use them then. So ask people just to do it on their own, and then to talk with either one other person or preferably 2 other people and see what you've said. Okay, just explore it. And then if we can get people back into a plenary, they've been chatting and they're feeling happy and relaxed, you get on with the plenary quite easily. You say, I wonder, can we just check, did anybody score the first one 5? And ask people to put their hands up if they did. Anybody score it 0? Now don't comment. Okay, you're not evaluating how people have responded. This is their personal view. Okay, nobody's judging other people. Okay, they've talked and they've compared notes, but nobody's judging. So you can move on to one beggar telling another. Did anybody score that 5? Anybody score it 0? Find out. Did anybody score 1, 2, 3, 4? So do that for each of these. Okay, so you get some feedback and some interaction happening, and people begin to see we don't all see things the same. Some of us are quite surprising in their views. So, you can do some really useful stuff with just this one excellent exercise. Now, just slightly digress. Doing mission is really about sharing a story. We can't evangelize without doing some kind of storytelling. Now, that may be telling bits of the Bible story from the New Testament. It may be telling something of our own personal experience, but it's storytelling. So here are a couple of exercises. This is sort of supplementary to the 3 exercises I'm explaining. But how would you share a good story? Take 5 minutes and talk with somebody else. So you pair them up, somebody who you know well, and about somebody you know well, and who either is or has been important in your life. Explain who they are, when and where you met them, what kind of person they are, why they are important to you. Okay? So ideally, the other person you're talking to should not know. And it might be a school teacher, it might be a neighbor or somebody at work or whatever. But each takes a few minutes to talk with somebody else. And the maximum amount of time you give them is each 5 minutes. That's a 10-minute exercise. Each one talks to the other. One talks, one listens. Okay, and at the end, you ask some questions. Here's another similar exercise. Excuse me a minute. Take 5 minutes to talk about a journey that you've been on. Perhaps going on holiday or to a special event. What about getting ready? How did you get ready? What transport did you use? Was it a long journey or a short journey? Did you stop anywhere? Did you see anything interesting on the way? How did you feel when you got there? Would you be prepared to do a trip like that again? Just get people talking about this, thinking about this. So you put this up on the screen or it's on some notes and they think and they reflect and then they talk. Again, 5 minutes talking to one another. If you can get both conversations in 5 minutes, that's pushing it a bit. 10 minutes, perhaps 5 minutes talking, 5 minutes listening. And then when you've got people sharing stories, we want to ask, how did you decide what to include? What sort of things did you leave out? How did sharing stories make you feel? And I can tell you, it almost always is great. People feel wonderful telling stories about things that are important or enjoyable to them, or even if it's been an interesting, eventful journey, that they'll share that, and they feel positive about sharing again. And you don't need to know how an engine works to tell a story about a journey, do you? And you don't need to know everything about the gospel and answer every critical question that might be thrown at you in order to share the story of Jesus. Right, here's another exercise. God speaks in different ways and at different times in people's lives. So take some time to reflect on the times when God has spoken into your life. Here's another useful exercise. Being conscious that God speaks in different ways and at different times to different people. Now, this was not particularly asking people to reflect on how they became Christians. People can use it for that. But primarily, it's just being aware that God speaks into our lives. How has he done that? When has he done it? And again, we can provide sheets that people can use. And I've got a checklist, which I'll show you in a moment. And that's very helpful. So again, we ask people to do it as privately, so maybe to reflect on it for, I don't know, maybe 5-10 minutes. And if we use this sheet that we've got, then they just tick the things that have been used. Now, they don't. This isn't an exhaustive list, but there are quite a number of things here, from direct evangelism, sermon in the church, Sunday school experiences, confirmation, communion, or something else. But you ask people just to tick, and then maybe to share in a one-to-one situation, or again in threes. Working in threes is quite helpful. It's a little easier than working in twos. Twos is okay if people are both quite good at mixing and both friendly, don't know each other too well. But threes makes it a lot easier, less pressured. So I did this. I've done this in numerous churches, and the outcome is really great because people become aware. And what's interesting is it's also helping people to begin to articulate their relationship with God. Many years ago, I helped produce a video for the Church of England, and our target was to work with what we might call ordinary Christians in rural Anglican churches. And one lady in the east of England, she was a lovely character, and we videoed her and her story. And she said, I've never had a real Christian experience, she said, as she started talking to us. But later on, she talks about walking her dog in the morning, and we've got lovely shots of her walking the dog through a meadow, with the dog leaping over tall grass. And as she's doing it, she says, I love these walks in the morning with the dog, and I can talk to God. And the amazing thing is, she says, sometimes when I'm talking to God, I have a sense of him talking back to me. Well, if that's not an experience, I don't know what is. So often people, it's only as they start to think and reflect and then articulate what their experiences have been, various things come to mind. So this is a useful exercise. And I tell you, get some surprises. I had a very surprising one. Man ticked the film one on one occasion, and he says, but it wasn't religious. So I said, can you tell me what it was? Well, he says, you'll be surprised. So I said, well, tell me what it was. And he says, it was The Omen. Now, The Omen is a horror film. And he said he saw The Omen. It's a lot of references to Revelation. So he went home, found he got a Bible somewhere, dug it out, read through Revelation. And then he went back and started with Matthew, and he read the Gospels. So that's how he became a Christian. And that was very intriguing. So that's another exercise worth thinking about. Now, the third of these three particular exercises, ignoring the ones on the storytelling, I sometimes will throw the storytelling one in early in the day, just as a warm-up, just as a warm-up icebreaker. But we can then reflect back on it and relate that to the issue of how do we feel when we're telling people about Jesus. So this is the third in the trilogy of exercises. What three things are there about Jesus that makes him special in your experience? Now, it's a subjective thing, in your experience. So this isn't about vague theology. This is about practical working theology. Okay, what's your experience of Jesus? And again, start with a personal list. Give people 10 minutes at least to write down three things. They may want to change their opinion after a while. Write something down and change it. But three things. Doesn't have to be ordered in importance. They can do that if they wish. They put down what's important to them. Then you ask them to share it with their other two people that they've been talking to. And they each explain what's on the list. And then listen to the others one by one. And they may interact and ask questions. Why did you say that? Why is that important to you? And so on. Because then what I want them to do is step 3 is, can you actually agree on one shared list? 3 things for you all. Now, I don't want people to be nice Christians and surrender what they value, but just to evaluate this. Well, it ought not to be possible to come up with one shared list. Occasionally it is, but it ought not to be done. So what you're actually doing is saying what Jesus is important to you. And I love this because if I've got clergy involved, they'll mention theological things. They'll talk about incarnation and imminence and all sorts of things. But ordinary Christians, the real people, will often say things like, he accepts me as I am. He puts up with me when I'm in a mood. He never gives up on me. So all sorts of valuable things in their experience that makes Jesus special. And of course, what they're actually doing, what you'd be doing if you're doing this exercise, maybe you need to pause it before I tell you. What you will be doing is evangelizing. You're sharing good news about Jesus from your point of view with somebody else. That's evangelism. So the E word is not as terrible as some people think. Now, let's get back to the story of Nehemiah. Okay, now Nehemiah faced an enormous challenge. How was he going to get it done? Well, clearly he believed that the main thing was to be sure that the main thing remained the main thing. He was focused on rebuilding the walls and getting the gates hung. A man called Donald McGavran, many years ago, I had the privilege of hearing him speak. He was the founding father of what was called the church growth movement. He studied why some churches were declining or static while others were growing, analysed it and came up with some reasons. And one of his key points was this: the reason most churches fail to grow is that they're busy doing things that they should, but at the expense of the one thing that they must. That's well worth sticking up on a minister's study wall. The reason most churches fail to grow is that they're busy doing things they should, but at the expense of the one thing they must. My apologies for a spelling error. Now, the main thing is to make sure the main thing remains the main thing. How are we going to do that? So here's a little exercise which is quite a challenge, and again we can provide materials to help you with this. This is a model of your church. The white circle is defining all the resources you have as a church: your money, your time, your people. The inner circles of different color are intended to illustrate various aspects that make up the life of your church. So it might be preaching, it might be pastoral visitation, excuse me, I do apologize. It may be a choir, it may be music, it may be Bible studies, all sorts of things. Okay, but all of those things. And the idea is that you think about what are taking up most of your resources. Now, perhaps you better start with just doing a list of these, a separate list, and then writing next to them what percentage of your resources you think. Now, this isn't refined. It's not exact science. This is just roughly, okay, just roughly. So you would know how many people are engaged in any particular aspect. How many people are there in the choir, for example? So you know how many people there are in things. How many people do pastoral visits, if you've got pastoral workers in your church, and so on. So how much money, how much time, how many people are involved. So that's the way it is now, okay? And then the aim is to produce a similar diagram, so the circle the same size, and change it to the way you feel it should be. Now, all of those circles, to make it work properly, all those inner circles need to be touching one another, but never overlapping, even if the same people are involved in more than one activity, okay? Try and keep it separate. So draw it as it is, and then draw it as you believe it ought to be, and then think about what are the implications. Now, the implications are very simple. If you've got something that you do not put much resources in, let's say that's illustrated by the little purple circle at the bottom, let's say that's evangelism. So that's your evangelistic resources, okay, and you're not using much in the way of evangelistic resources. If you're not putting much in the way of resources, but you feel you need to change it, and you want to make that mauve circle therefore larger, what has to happen? Well, quite clearly, some of the other circles have either got to disappear or be reduced in size. Now, you only have a limited amount of resources, people, money and time. And if you're going to look at what the main thing is for your church, you need to think of what is going to be the consequence. Now, Nehemiah often found himself potentially distracted. He had opposition from other post holders in the area that were going to lose their power and their position. People got tired. There was rubble from previous building. There were injustices. And Nehemiah responded to each of these and adjusted. Some he ignored, some he made a matter of prayer, and some of the injustice things he dealt with in a wonderful way. But he kept coming back to the main thing all the time. Now, up to now, I have primarily talked about outreach evangelism. And that kind of activity is part of mission, but it isn't the whole of mission. Evangelism is part of mission, but mission is not evangelism. The Church of England very kindly produced, actually it wasn't the Church of England, it was the Anglican Communion, the whole Anglican Communion around the world, produced 5 marks of mission. And it's not a bad idea to, again, produce this list. You can reproduce it from the video or we'll send it to you. So, to proclaim the good news, to preach, to teach, baptize and nurture new believers, to respond to human need with loving service, to transform unjust structures of society, and to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and to sustain and renew the life of the earth. Now, I see all of those as mission as well, but the question might be to ask yourselves, if we were to say how well we are doing out of 10, what would you say you're doing in terms of sharing the good news with people beyond the 4 walls of your church? Score it out of 10. What about teaching, baptizing and nurturing new believers? Is that going on? So each of these you score. And you can see where your strengths are, where your weaknesses. But this is not an optional picking list. This is intended to be a holistic understanding of what mission is. So when you're looking at evangelism, maybe it helps also to put it into the context. Well, we're moving to an end, and I'm conscious that I've probably left out lots of things that on reflection I might wish I had said, and probably have said things I wish I hadn't said as well. But I want to finish up by asking you whether you're a Porky Pig or a Jimmy Cricket. Do you know the difference? Looney Tunes used to end up with Porky the Pig, who would say, "That's all, folks." Whereas Jimmy Cricket used to have a catch line that say, "And there's more, and there's more." Well, we have more of God to discover. We have more good news to share with others. We have more experiences of God's grace and power and love in our lives that should be overflowing from us so that other people want to know what it is about us that makes us different. Let's be Jimmy Cricket people. There's always more, and not shut the door, draw the line, finish the story with a "that's all, folks." So here's the contact details. drop me a line, send me an email, let me know if there's any way in which I can help you. I hope this has helped you. May God bless you. He wants to use you if you can have enough courage to say, Lord, here am I. What can I do with you to help your mission?